So that's a great segue into our next topic, which is market-based solutions, which one that many consumers or environmentally conscious consumers at least are familiar with, which are certifications. So seafood, like many other types of food, has a number of certification programs, including the Aquaculture Stewardship Council and Best Aquaculture Practices. And these can be useful tools for marine aquaculture producers and companies to differentiate themselves as a sustainable producer. They can also more broadly provide greater assurances to the public that these producers are acting responsibly. But Cathy, to what extent do you think that these certifications are going to be part of the strategy to, or need to be part of the strategy to expand marine aquaculture in the U.S.?
So Kim, I think you answered the question in your question, because I have always looked at these certification strategies as basically a part of a risk management strategy for a producer. So while I agree with Frank and Doug that consumers play a large role in this and what the consumer preferences are, it's also increasingly true that the marketplace decides whether, and to some extent, without even thinking about necessarily what the consumer is asking for. Because sometimes the consumer is not asking for it, but the market, the place that the producers are selling their product to, the ultimate distribution, whether it's a restaurant chain or a large retailer like a Walmart or Whole Foods that's now part of Amazon. What does that segment of the market ask for from the producers? And there are times you can think of these large entities as looking for assurances from the producers that they aren't going to have their name on the top of what used to be the top of the fold of a newspaper. Now I guess it's on the first piece of your scrolling on your iPad of what the local newspapers are. They're not going to be news as to having purchased their seafood from a producer that is going to make them look bad. And certification is a risk management tool for the person who's buying your fish, the company that's buying your fish. They want to see that whether it's an actual certification like the BAP or the ASC or any of those, or if it's the sort of a rating from the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch program or some other entity, somehow the buyer wants to know that your product is identified as being sustainable because that mitigates their risk. And yes, indeed, they can turn around and tell the customer that you can feel good about buying something that is environmentally sustainable. So that's sort of on the who are you selling it to, and this is why you want to have the certification. And the other piece to that, of course, is that if you can't compete in that market, you can't sell to those buyers, then who are you going to sell it to? And are you going to be able to get your product to market without the certification? Some ways, yes, but not to those folks who want to be able to document and show that to their customers that they're actually providing them with a product that they can feel good about.
Okay, so the U.S. is, as we mentioned before, Doug mentioned before, the U.S. is widely recognized as being some of the best managed seafood in the world. And if we're talking about growing and expanding domestic marine aquaculture, the question is, how would the fact that it's being produced in a highly regulated U.S. waters measure up to certification? Could that hold up in place of certifications in terms of greater assurances that it's produced responsibly?
Well, I think that does have an impact on the buyers themselves, but if you take it then to the level of the customer, the consumers, I'm not sure that they know that. Not all of the U.S. population is as in tune with fisheries management regulations in the United States as we are. In other words, we know that. But if I were to go out on the street out here and capture one of these undergrads walking by, and I had asked them about, U.S. produced seafood, they'd look at me like I was a little bit nuts. Do you disagree, Frank?
No, I perfectly agree.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it's interesting though. Maine salmon gets $5 a pound for being produced in Maine, according to Sebastian Bell. And the Cook salmon guys were really reluctant to introduce it because they thought that it would harm the Canadian production, which is the lion's share of the production. But then finally, in I think 2016, they started to sell it as labeled produced in the US. And since they didn't have much faith in it, they wanted a hefty premium. And now they're selling it all over as made in the US. Mike Rubino really hates it because he said that he used to be able to get Maine salmon at his local Wegmans. That is going other places now. So there are other supply chains that are willing to pay that premium that get it now because it's important enough for them to tell that it's made in the US.
But that's a little different. I mean, when you're talking about identifying something as a Maine salmon, it's a little bit like identifying something as an Idaho potato, right? It's
No, they sell it as made in the US, but it's really only in Maine that are producing farm salmon in the US. I know there's a little bit in Washington State, but yeah. So they at least according to Sebastian, they sell it as made in the US.
So does that kind of go to there are certain niche markets where the local produced locally tends to be a niche market that people will pay more for? Is that where US produced seafood could fit?
I don't know, and it probably varies because it also seems to vary by species and it tends to vary by region. It's also really interesting how these imported species makes up a much bigger share of US seafood consumption in the Midwest and the mountains than they do along the coast, which has to do with again, supply chains and reliability of delivery. Think about it. If you operate Applebee's, you have the same menu on 5,000 restaurants. You have to have suppliers that can provide you with the same product year round to all those 5,000 restaurants. And that's the requirement if you want to be in that segment. So for good or for bad, there are lots of different segments.
Well, and to follow up on that, the interesting thing, if you look at menus of large restaurants like an Applebee's or Red Lobster or whatever, they don't like to change those menus very often. And so when they put a menu in place and they pick a price point for the dish, say it's $8.99 or $15.99, they want to make sure that they, for a long period of time, get their inputs in a way that allows them to maintain that price on that menu, which has a huge implication for your supply chain and sourcing of fish at a relatively consistent price without a lot of volatility. And that then has implications for, again, going back to Doug's point of economy of scale and size and large amounts that can be supplied to the market as opposed to the local and smaller niche, which is going to be highly variable and much more uncertain. And that there you have to be a local restaurant where your menu can change on a whim based on what's available and what the prices are, as opposed to those very large chains.
So, and that's a really important point, and I think you guys have all kind of said this throughout this conversation, but I just want to hear you guys clarify this. Is that in order to have an economically viable seafood supply, it has to be a diverse portfolio of inputs to the system. Am I capturing that correctly? Different scales, different sizes, different types.
Yes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Different sources of product. I think we've touched on almost every segment in some way, and they all play a different role.
So we've had great discussions about the role that seafood plays in the market, that we need a diverse portfolio of solutions. So we need imports, but we also need to expand our domestic seafood production. And wild and farmed, it sounds like, can play nice in the market.